For veteran Daniel Harper, silence was meant to be his only companion after the funeral of his foster father. But on that misty morning, inside the forgotten attic above the town square, his loyal German shepherd Rex froze before a dust-covered bell. Its bronze surface was cracked with age, yet a strange shimmer traced the marks where countless hands had struck it. This was no relic. It was a call. A voice older than the town itself, a legacy men would soon fight to steal. Daniel didn't know that protecting this bell would draw him into a battle for memory, justice, and the dignity of the man who raised him. Please support us by subscribing to the channel to follow this powerful journey. Brindleford sat in a narrow valley where late autumn air cut sharp and thin, a place where the sun rose reluctantly and the frost lingered long past morning. The river that divided the town flowed slate gray, its edges frosted like glass, and the maples along Main Street had already shed their color, their bare limbs rattling whenever the wind passed through. Shop windows glimmered weakly beneath a sky the color of tarnished steel. At the center of town, the square stretched wide and lonely. In its middle stood the old belfry, a timber frame with a peaked tin roof, once proud, now dulled with rust. Hanging inside was a bronze bell, its mouth darkened by years of weather and wear. The bell no longer rang. Since the illness of the man who tended it, the town woke only to alarm clocks and cell phone chimes. Without the bell, mornings felt incomplete, as if something essential had been misplaced. On the edge of the square, Daniel Harper stood quietly, watching the silent belfry. At 52, he was a man carved by work and by solitude. Tall but lean, his frame suggested strength once abundant, now worn thin. His face was square-jawed and weathered, a scar tracing beneath his chin from an accident years back in a welding shop. His beard grew in gray stubble, and his hair, once thick, had thinned to an iron-colored brush. His clothing was plain, a heavy canvas coat frayed at the cuffs, faded jeans, and boots scarred at the toes. His hands, large and calloused, rested quietly at his sides, twitching only when memories threatened. Daniel's silence often made others uneasy, and the townsfolk sometimes mistook it for coldness. In truth, he had simply learned to conserve his voice the way one saves a flame on a windy night. Beside him sat his companion, Rex. The German shepherd was 10 years old, his muzzle frosted with gray, his chest broad and proud, though his left hip clicked faintly when he rose. His coat was a mix of sable and tan, and one ear carried a jagged nick from an old misstep with a fence. Rex's dark eyes followed Daniel closely, filled with loyalty and vigilance. He had been a working dog once, trained to follow commands and face danger without hesitation, but injury had ended that chapter. Daniel had taken him home, and in Rex he found the only creature whose presence never demanded explanation. To the townsfolk, Rex was just a dog. To Daniel, he was the last thread keeping him stitched to the world. Across the street, the bakery's windows steamed with the smell of rye bread and sugar. Inside, Marnie Booker wiped a pane clear with her flour-dusted hand. At 68, she was wiry and strong, her long white braid coiled neatly at her neck. She had run the bakery alone since her husband's passing. Marnie was known for fair prices, a quick laugh, and words delivered straight as an arrow. Catching Daniel's eye, she tilted her head toward the silent belfry. "Still sleeping?" she called softly through the glass, then opened the eye doctor to let warmth spill out. "The world's too quiet when an honest bell won't speak." Daniel offered her a faint smile. "The world's loud enough," he replied. "It's just the wrong things making the noise." On the corner by the gas station stood Darren Pike, a man of 40, with the body of someone younger, but the eyes of someone who had drifted too long. He had a mop of dark hair combed poorly over a growing bald spot, a long chin, and a mouth quick to twist into a smirk. Darren dragged a squeegee down a window, nodding at Daniel with forced cheer. "Morning," he said. "Looks like more snow if we're lucky." His laugh came shallow, a sound that checked for approval before it finished. Darren was the type who had shrugged when the bell went silent, saying cell phones were better anyway. There were many like him. Resigned, practical, unwilling to fight for something that felt old-fashioned. Rex watched him for a moment, ears twitching, then turned back to the belfry. Daniel walked a slow lap around the courthouse lawn. The courthouse itself, red brick with peeling white trim, had never looked truly clean. A bronze soldier out front stared into an imagined distance. The square felt hollow without the bell's voice. He remembered his foster father, Henry, striding across this very square when he was still strong. Henry was not tall, but he was solid, his chest like a barrel and his wrists thick as rope. He wore the same worn cap every morning, eyes the color of river mud, steady and unflinching. Henry's task had been simple. Strike the bell to wake the town, to warn of fire, flood, or danger. He took it as sacred duty. Some mocked him as eccentric, the old man with his morning clamor, but many quietly set their lives by his ringing. The rhythm of his bell had saved lives during a mill fire and rallied townsfolk during a flood. But illness had taken Henry's strength. The last time Daniel saw him at the belfry, he had stood there uncertain, looking up at the rope, as if it no longer belonged to him. His voice, cracked by age and sickness, had whispered, "You'll have to teach me, son." Since then, the bell had been silent. Daniel carried the silence like a stone in his chest. The town endured without it. People nodded to Daniel as they passed, but their eyes carried pity, not respect. Some, like old Mrs. Canfield, 75, with her brown paper skin and kind heart, reminded him gently that Henry had a fighter's heart. Others dismissed it. "Maybe it's for the best," one man told him. "That bell just woke babies. We've got sirens now." Daniel let such words wash over him. They did not understand that the bell was not just sound. It was belonging. Later that morning, Daniel saw a young mother pulling her boy away from the fountain, where he had been tapping at ice with a stick. Her hair was dark and braided, her coat thin, her face tired but kind. She smiled apologetically. "Sorry," she said. Then, almost shyly, she added, "My grandfather met my grandmother because of that bell. He said it saved him from missing the bus." She blushed at her own words and hurried on. Daniel watched her go, and for a moment warmth returned to his chest. Rex nudged Daniel's leg, urging him onward. Together they crossed the square once more. The weak sun slipped from behind a cloud, catching the bell and making its bronze glimmer faintly. Rex sat without command, ears high, eyes fixed on the silent metal. Daniel followed his gaze, and for a heartbeat he thought he felt the air hum, as if the bell still remembered its voice. He shook the thought away. Hope was dangerous when misplaced. "Come on, partner," he murmured. Rex rose, shook himself briskly, and fell in at his side. Together, man and dog walked away, leaving the square to its silence, though both carried the weight of the bell as if it still rang inside their chests. The day Henry was laid to rest dawned gray and wet, a drizzle falling in soft needles that clung to coats and stung the skin with chill. The cemetery lay on a low hill at the edge of Brindleford, where rows of gravestones leaned unevenly under the weight of years. The iron gate at its entrance creaked when Daniel Harper pushed it open, the sound echoing in the damp air. His boots pressed into mud, leaving heavy impressions as though every step carried the burden of memory. He was dressed in his only suit, a dark wool set he had worn only twice before, once for his failed marriage, and once for his mother's passing. It fit tightly now, the shoulders snug, the cuffs frayed, but it was the best he had. His beard had been trimmed that morning, and his iron-gray hair combed flat, though the rain undid the effort quickly, plastering strands to his forehead. His face carried the rigid solemnity of a man determined not to falter, but the red around his eyes betrayed his sleepless night. Beside him walked Rex, his German shepherd, wearing no collar but moving with solemn grace. The dog's sable and tan coat, though dampened by rain, still carried its proud sheen. His ears twitched with every sound, but his steps were slow, deliberate, as if he understood the gravity of this journey. Rex's dark eyes scanned the cemetery ahead, sharp and alert, but softened whenever they returned to Daniel. For the dog, grief was not spoken in words, but shown in his nearness. He never strayed more than a step away, brushing his master's leg with his shoulder, as though anchoring Daniel against the emptiness. The priest awaited them at the gravesite, a man in his late 50s named Father Alcott. He was tall, thin as a reed, with shoulders that seemed to slope inward from carrying too many sorrows at once. His face was narrow, with pale skin stretched over angular bones and a mouth that rarely smiled. His hair, silver and thinning, clung damply to his temples, and his eyes, a washed blue, seemed tired from decades of consoling families who did not always want consolation. Father Alcott was not a man of flamboyant sermons, but of quiet endurance, the kind of figure who spoke little yet carried on his duties without complaint. Today, even he seemed wearier than usual, his cassock soaked through at the edges. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said softly, his voice carrying more sincerity than flourish. Daniel nodded stiffly, unable to reply. Only 3 others stood near the grave, 2 neighbors and the undertaker. Mrs. Canfield, the 75-year-old widow with brown paper skin and a back slightly bent from years of housekeeping, held a small umbrella that trembled in her thin hands. Her eyes were red, her lips pressed tightly, as though holding back words of comfort she feared would cheapen the moment. Next to her was young Tom Riley, a 23-year-old mechanic from the edge of town, a stocky man with grease permanently etched into the lines of his hands. He wore a jacket too light for the weather, his short blonde hair plastered to his forehead, his jaw square and tight. Tom had worked on Henry's tools once and had spoken often of the old man's patience. He stood with his arms folded, not to appear rude, but to contain the discomfort of seeing someone he admired lowered into the ground. The undertaker, Mr. Dalton, was a barrel-shaped man in his 60s with a ruddy complexion, thinning white hair, and hands that always smelled faintly of tobacco. He performed his work with a professional detachment, his gaze focused on the mechanics of the burial rather than the grief of the living. The absence was louder than the presence. No cousins, no distant relatives, no one who carried Henry's blood had bothered to come. They had long dismissed him as eccentric, a relic of another age, the old fool with the mourning bell. To them, his death was little more than the closing of a chapter they had no interest in reading. Daniel felt the hollow ache of that absence pressing in on him. He stood rigid at the head of the grave, the rain seeping into his suit, his jaw clenched hard enough to ache. Father Alcott opened his book and read verses in a low, steady tone, words about peace and rest that seemed to drift away in the mist without catching hold of anyone's heart. Mrs. Canfield sniffled. Tom shifted on his feet, and the undertaker adjusted the ropes. Daniel's eyes never left the coffin. Plain pine, simple, no polish, no ornate handles, just a box to hold the weight of a life that had carried an entire town for decades. As the casket was lowered, Rex lay down on the wet grass, pressing his body close to the earth, his head lifted, his eyes locked on the descending wood. His ears tilted forward, his gaze unblinking, as though he too refused to let Henry be swallowed by the soil without witness. Daniel placed a hand over his chest, where the weight of unspoken words pressed heavily. He had no speech prepared, no polished phrases to recite. Instead, he bent slowly, knees aching, and laid a bouquet of wildflowers atop the coffin. They were not roses or lilies, he could not afford such things, but hardy blooms gathered from the edge of the forest, flowers Henry would have recognized. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. "They may forget you, but I won't. I swear it." The drizzle thickened into rain, each drop pattering on wood, soil, and umbrella. The undertaker began shoveling dirt, each thud striking Daniel's chest like a hammer. Mrs. Canfield stepped forward, placing a wrinkled hand gently on his arm. "He was proud of you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Daniel nodded but could not trust himself to answer. Tom muttered, "World's colder without him," before looking away, embarrassed by his own sentiment. When the grave was filled and the mound of earth stood fresh and raw, Father Alcott closed his book with a weary sigh. The others drifted away one by one, leaving Daniel and Rex alone. The town below hummed faintly in the mist. Car engines, laughter from the diner, the sharp cry of a child. But here on the hill, silence wrapped around them. Daniel knelt by the grave, his trousers soaked, and pressed his hand into the damp soil. Rex pressed close, lying against his side, his eyes not on Daniel, but fixed on the direction of the town square, as though listening for the bell that no longer rang. Daniel followed his gaze. The outline of the belfry was just visible through the drizzle, a dark shape against the pale horizon. He drew a slow breath and whispered, "Your voice isn't gone, Henry. Not while I'm here. I'll make them remember." The vow lingered in the air like smoke, fragile yet unbreakable. Daniel rose stiffly, Rex at his side, and together they walked back toward the silent town, the bell still unseen but heavy in their thoughts. The rain had softened by the following morning, but the clouds still hung heavy over Brindleford, draping the town in a dim half-light. Daniel Harper walked slowly toward the old house that had belonged to his foster father, Henry. The house stood just off the square, its once bright clapboard siding now dulled to a washed gray, the paint curling like old bark. The windows were clouded by dust and streaked with watermarks, and the porch sagged at the edges, its railing leaning forward like tired shoulders. Daniel paused at the gate, Rex pacing beside him, ears turning at each creak of wood and rustle of leaves. The German shepherd's coat was still damp from the morning walk, but his body moved with purpose, his nose twitching as though the air itself carried a story. The door opened stiffly when Daniel pressed his weight against it, the hinges groaning like a reluctant memory. Inside, the house smelled of dust, oil, and time. The living room lay quiet, its furniture cloaked in a thin film of neglect. An armchair with the imprint of Henry's shape still etched into its cushions, a low table scattered with yellowed newspapers, a cold lamp with a frayed cord that had not seen light in years. The curtains sagged heavily, filtering the pale daylight into long gray streaks that stretched across the floor. Rex padded ahead, his nails clicking faintly against the wood, moving from room to room with the methodical precision of a sentinel. Daniel's boots left faint prints in the dust as he walked through the hallway. Each step stirred motes that floated up into the still air like restless spirits. The kitchen smelled faintly of old spices, shelves lined with jars whose labels had faded to ghosts of words. On the wall above the sink hung a calendar, its last page marked 10 years past, a frozen testament to Henry's indifference to keeping time in any way but through the bell. Daniel ran his hand across the counter, feeling the grooves cut into the wood from decades of use. He remembered evenings when Henry had sat there in silence, sipping black coffee while the town square outside slumbered, waiting for the bell to call it awake. Rex's low growl broke his thoughts. The dog stood rigid at the end of the narrow hallway, his ears pricked forward, his body tense with recognition. His nose pressed toward the ceiling as he sniffed, then turned his gaze to a door at the far end. Daniel followed, his heart tightening as memory rushed in. It was the attic door. The door itself was plain, oak darkened with age, but its surface bore scratches near the handle. Marks from years of being turned away, marks Daniel himself had made as a curious child. He remembered standing before it decades earlier, his small hand reaching for the knob, only to be stopped by Henry's calloused palm settling firmly on his shoulder. Henry's voice had been calm, but unyielding. "Not now, boy. Some rooms aren't meant for children." At the time, Daniel had assumed it was nothing more than a place for broken tools or moth-eaten coats. But the way Henry's eyes had shifted, steady yet shadowed, left an impression Daniel never forgot. Now, standing as a grown man at 52, with Rex tense beside him, that memory returned with sharper edges. The knob was rusted, the lock intact, its keyhole dark like an unblinking eye. Rex pawed at the door suddenly, his nails raking against the wood, his body low and insistent. He barked once, sharp and commanding, the sound startling in the otherwise muffled house. Then he looked back at Daniel, ears angled forward, his entire body telling him, Here lies something." Daniel pressed his hand against the wood, the surface cool and rough beneath his palm. His breath slowed as his chest rose and fell with a steady weight. He had opened many doors in his life, military barracks, warehouses, shuttered homes, but this one pressed back against him without even moving. He stepped back, his eyes lingering on the lock, and in that silence Henry's words echoed again. "Not now, boy." Rex growled softly, pacing in front of the door before sitting, his gaze fixed as though he could see beyond it. Daniel exhaled slowly, lowering himself onto the dusty stair at the end of the hall. He ran a hand through his graying hair, his jaw tight. The house around him was quiet, except for the faint ticking of an old clock in the parlor, its pendulum swaying though no one had wound it in years. He knew that whatever lay behind that door was something Henry had guarded fiercely. He also knew the weight of promises, the vow he had made at the grave, to not let Henry be erased. The afternoon light shifted as clouds thinned slightly, sending pale gold through the dusty curtains. The beam landed across the hallway, glinting faintly against the lock. Daniel felt the pull grow stronger. He stood again, brushing dust from his trousers, and laid his hand once more on the knob. It resisted, immovable. Rex leaned closer, sniffing at the crack near the bottom, his breath stirring the dust into restless swirls. Daniel whispered hoarsely, "What did you keep from me, old man?" His voice was low, carrying both reverence and suspicion. But he did not force the lock, not yet. He stepped back once more, drawing Rex with him. The attic would reveal itself in time, but it would not be broken into. Henry had kept it closed for a reason, and Daniel would uncover that reason carefully, not by violence. He turned toward the parlor, the silence of the house pressing in around him, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt that the weight of the town's forgotten bell had followed him inside. The following day, Daniel Harper returned to Henry's old house, the weight of the locked attic door still pressing on his mind like an unanswered riddle. The sky over Brindleford remained heavy, gray as lead, but the rain had thinned to a fine drizzle that streaked faint lines against the dirty windows. When Daniel stepped inside, the air greeted him with the same musty scent of dust, oil, and wood that had soaked into the beams over decades. Rex trotted close behind him, the German shepherd's ears alert, nose twitching, as though the dog too recognized that the house was not merely empty, but waiting. Daniel lit a small lamp he had brought with him, placing it on the kitchen table. The flame wavered, throwing shadows that danced against the cabinets. He searched the drawers methodically, beginning in the kitchen where Henry had spent much of his solitary life. In one drawer, he found faded receipts bundled with string, proof of years of purchases made in cash. In another lay rusty tools, their handles smooth with use. None of it mattered until his hand pressed against the back of the lowest drawer. Something shifted. He pulled carefully, and a thin wooden panel slid loose, revealing a hollow space. Inside lay a bundle of notebooks, their leather covers cracked, their corners chewed by time. Daniel lifted them out one by one, blowing dust that rose like ghostly breath. He carried them into the parlor, setting them gently on the coffee table where Henry's hands had once rested daily. Rex settled by his boots, watching closely, his dark eyes fixed as though sensing that what was about to be revealed was more than mere ink. The first notebook opened with Henry's precise handwriting, surprisingly steady for a man often dismissed as clumsy or eccentric. The early pages carried simple notes. Bell struck at dawn, 5:32. Cold air, frost on ground. 2 men from mill nodded in passing. The entries continued, recording each morning's ringing as faithfully as if it were a ledger of existence. But as Daniel flipped through, the tone shifted. Descriptions grew longer, fuller. One entry described a storm that had swept through Brindleford 20 years ago. Wind tearing through roofs, rain heavy as stones. Bell struck at midnight, rang until arms ached. Families gathered in square, saved from flood by time enough to move. Daniel paused, feeling the weight of the words. He remembered that night dimly, the frantic movement, the confusion. But he had not known Henry had stood for hours in the storm, striking the bell without rest. Further in, Daniel found an account of a fire. July, heat thick as wool, sparks from sawmill spread fast, children asleep, smoke rising. Bell called the town awake. Men and women rushed with buckets. Barn saved, no lives lost. Arms burned from rope, but better rope than people. The writing was simple, almost blunt, but its force lay in the clarity of purpose. Henry had not seen the bell as noise. He had seen it as a weapon against disaster. Daniel turned to another notebook. This one carried more personal reflections. He read of a child who had gone missing in the woods. Bell rang in short bursts, guiding searchers. Child found cold, but alive. Mother wept at my feet, said Bell saved her boy. I told her the bell is only iron. She said iron can carry God's hand. Daniel stopped, the words catching in his throat. He had never known this story, yet here it was, hidden in Henry's neat script, preserved without fanfare. Hours passed as Daniel pored over the notebooks. Each page seemed to breathe with moments of the town's hidden history. Moments Henry had carried silently while the townsfolk dismissed him as an oddity. And then, near the end of the final notebook, Daniel found what made his breath halt. The last entry was written in a shaking hand, the ink smudged, the letters uneven as though Henry had written it while weak with illness. Do not let them sell the bell. It is not mine. It is not theirs. It is the soul of us all. The words blurred before Daniel's eyes as he read them again and again. He could picture Henry, frail and alone, bending over the page with determination, his body failing but his will unbroken. Daniel leaned back in the chair, his hands trembling as he closed the notebook. Rex stirred, rising to place his head on Daniel's knee, his dark eyes steady and calm. Daniel rubbed the dog's ear absent-mindedly, his mind spinning. This was more than record-keeping. This was testimony. Proof that Henry's bell had been the heartbeat of Brindleford, proof that its silence now was not progress but neglect. He set the notebooks back on the table in a careful stack, his jaw tight. The town might have forgotten, but Henry had left a voice behind, written in ink instead of bronze. And now, that voice belonged to Daniel to protect. He looked once more at the closed attic door at the end of the hall, the key still missing, the mystery still unresolved. But with the notebooks in hand, Daniel knew one truth already. Henry had fought to make the bell more than metal. Daniel would fight to keep it from being lost. The lamp flame flickered low, shadows lengthened, and Daniel whispered into the silence, his vow echoing the final words on the page. "They won't sell it, not while I breathe." Rex barked softly once, as though sealing the promise. The next morning carried a strange stillness over Brindleford. Clouds had thinned, letting a pale, washed-out sun spill over the square. The air was sharp, the kind that cut the lungs with every breath, and frost lingered along the edges of rooftops. Daniel Harper returned to Henry's house, with the weight of the notebooks still heavy in his satchel. He had not slept much. Each word Henry had written pulsed in his mind, like the echo of a bell that refused to be silenced. Rex padded close by his side, the German shepherd's paws crunching softly over the brittle grass, his ears pricked in constant vigilance. Inside, the house greeted them with the same stale scent. But Daniel felt its silence differently now. Less empty, more expectant. He moved through the parlor and climbed the narrow staircase that led to Henry's small bedroom. The room was cold, the curtains drawn, the quilt on the bed still bearing the faint impression of Henry's body. Daniel opened the wardrobe, its hinges squeaking in protest, and began pulling through the clothes that hung inside. Old flannel shirts, a heavy wool coat patched at the elbows, trousers with seams worn thin. It was in the pocket of a faded brown jacket that his hand closed around something metallic. He drew it out, slowly. A small wooden box, no larger than a shoebox, smooth with age and darkened with oil from years of handling. The lid bore shallow scratches, initials carved faintly. H.M. Daniel's chest tightened. He sat on the bed, Rex watching intently from the doorway, and opened the box. Inside lay a ring of keys, heavy and cold, each one different in size and shape. Some were old, iron teeth dulled with rust, others newer, brass glinting faintly even in the dim light. Daniel turned them in his palm, the jingling sound strangely loud in the silent room. Among them, one stood out, a thick iron key with a square bow, tarnished but solid. Rex rose, tail wagging slowly, ears tilted forward as though he too recognized the significance. The dog pressed close, his nose brushing against the box, then turning toward the door with quiet urgency. Daniel whispered hoarsely, "You know, don't you?" He pocketed the keys, his heart hammering. They moved back down the hallway, the floor creaking beneath their weight. The locked attic door loomed ahead, the scratches near its knob catching faint light like scars. Daniel paused before it, pressing his hand against the wood as he had the day before. Rex sat firmly at his side now, posture rigid, ears straight, eyes locked forward like a soldier awaiting command. Daniel exhaled deeply, fingers trembling as he selected the iron key. It slid into the lock with surprising ease, the metal groaning faintly as though reluctant to surrender after decades of silence. He turned it slowly. A dull click echoed down the hallway. The door gave way with a long, reluctant creak, a draft of cold, stale air rushing out. Daniel lifted his lamp and stepped inside, Rex following, close, his nails tapping against the wooden floor. The attic stretched wide under the slanted roof, beams heavy with cobwebs. Dust rose in thick waves with each step, catching the lamplight like drifting ash. Boxes lay stacked against the walls, their labels faded beyond recognition. Tools rusted in piles, a trunk with brass corners half hidden beneath a rotting tarp. But it was not the clutter that held Daniel's gaze. At the far end of the attic, resting on a wooden stand as though displayed with reverence, was the bell. It was larger than Daniel remembered from childhood, when he had glimpsed it only from afar. Its bronze surface was darkened with tarnish, streaked with green where time had bitten into it. Yet beneath the grime it still shimmered faintly, catching the lamplight in quiet defiance. Its mouth yawned wide, heavy and solemn, the clapper inside like the tongue of some slumbering beast. The rope that had once connected it to the belfry hung coiled beside it, frayed but intact. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He approached slowly, each step sounding louder in his ears, until he stood before it. Rex sat upright at the base of the stand, ears erect, body perfectly still. His eyes locked onto the bell with a focus Daniel had never seen before, as though he recognized it not merely as an object but as a relic. The dog did not growl, did not whine. He simply kept watch, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, his presence declaring that this was not just metal, but something to guard. Daniel reached out and laid his hand against the bell's cold surface. It thrummed faintly beneath his palm, or perhaps it was only his pulse echoing into the bronze. He remembered Henry's words in the notebooks. "Do not let them sell the bell. It is the soul of us all." Now, standing before it, Daniel understood. This was not an artifact. It was the heart of the town, silent yet still alive, waiting for someone to defend it. For several long minutes he remained there, hand resting on the bell, Rex beside him. The attic seemed to close in, its shadows circling but unable to touch the bond between man, dog, and bell. Finally, Daniel withdrew his hand and whispered, "I'll keep it safe, I swear." Rex's ears flicked, and he gave a low, approving bark that echoed softly through the rafters. The chapter of silence had ended. The fight to protect Henry's legacy had only just begun. The attic was still and heavy, the air thick with dust that clung to Daniel's coat as he stood before the bell. His hand lingered against the tarnished bronze surface, but something at its base caught his eye. A small wooden chest pushed against the wall, half hidden beneath an old wool blanket. The chest was narrow, with brass hinges dulled by years of neglect, its lid warped but intact. Daniel crouched, brushing away dust, and pulled it into the light. Rex circled once, then sat close, ears tilted forward, his eyes sharp and curious as though sensing the weight of what was inside. Daniel lifted the latch, and the lid creaked open, releasing a faint scent of paper and oil. Inside lay a stack of envelopes and small bundles of documents tied neatly with twine. Some bore stains from age, others were brittle and yellowing. The first bundle contained town records, notes about storms, fires, and community meetings, Henry's meticulous archiving of Brindleford's life. Beneath those papers, Daniel found medals lined in faded ribbons, tokens of recognition Henry had never spoken of. But at the bottom, pressed between the folds of a wool cloth, was a single envelope. It was clean compared to the others, the paper thicker, its seal unbroken. Across the front, written in Henry's distinct hand, was Daniel's name. His breath caught. The letters seemed heavier than ink, as though they had been carved into the page by the weight of his foster father's intent. Daniel sat down on the attic floor, his back against the beam, and turned the envelope over in his rough hands. Rex pressed closer, the German shepherd's warm body steady against his leg, his eyes fixed intently on Daniel's face. Slowly, Daniel broke the seal and unfolded the paper within. The letter began without flourish. "Daniel, if you are reading this, then I am gone." The handwriting wavered, strokes uneven but still recognizable. Daniel's throat tightened as he traced each line with his eyes. Henry wrote of the bell's importance, not as a tool of noise but as a vessel of memory. "You were the only one who ever listened. You understood that each strike of the bell was more than iron on iron. It was a reminder that we lived, that we endured storms and fire, that children came home, that mornings had meaning. When the bell still rings, memory breathes. When it falls silent, memory begins to die." Daniel paused, his chest rising with a heavy breath. He could almost hear Henry's voice, low and steady, echoing in the cramped attic. Rex shifted, placing his muzzle gently against Daniel's boot, a quiet gesture of comfort. The letter continued, darker now. "They will come for it, Daniel. The others will see only metal, weight, and price. They will try to turn it into money, and in doing so they will strip away its soul. You must not let them. This bell is not mine alone. It belongs to Brindleford. It belongs to all those who woke to its sound, all those who ran when it warned, all those who found their way home by its voice. You are the only one I trust to guard it, because you know what it means to carry silence, to live unseen, and still stand." Daniel swallowed hard. He could remember countless moments when Henry's bell had cut through chaos, storms that had forced people into the square, fires that drew neighbors together, the lost child guided home. He had lived in Henry's shadow, but never understood until now how deeply the old man had shouldered the town's life. The last lines were written in a trembling script, almost illegible, as though Henry's strength had nearly given out. "Do not let them turn the bell into a commodity. Do not let them erase its voice. Promise me, son. Promise me the bell will live as long as you do." Daniel lowered the paper, his eyes blurred with tears. He pressed it against his chest, curling forward as though trying to embrace the man who had raised him one last time. His body shook silently, his jaw clenched to stifle the sobs that threatened to break loose. Rex rose and leaned against him firmly, the dog's muzzle nudging at his arm. Daniel felt the rough warmth of Rex's fur beneath his hand and knew the animal understood in his own way. The German shepherd gave a low whine, not of fear, but of solidarity. In that moment, Daniel was no longer alone in his vow. The attic seemed less oppressive now, the shadows softer, as if Henry's presence had seeped into the very beams and rafters. Daniel sat for a long time, his fingers still clutching the letter, his mind replaying each word. He thought of the town outside, people who had long dismissed Henry as a harmless eccentric, never knowing what he carried. He thought of the family who had turned their backs, and of those who might come seeking profit. And he thought of his promise, already forming, already binding. When finally he stood, his legs stiff, Daniel tucked the letter carefully back into its envelope and placed it inside his coat. He looked once more at the bell, its tarnished surface glowing faintly in the lamplight, and spoke aloud, his voice low but firm. "I promise." Rex's ears flicked at the sound, and the dog sat straighter, as though bearing witness to the vow. Daniel extinguished the lamp and descended the stairs, the keys rattling faintly in his pocket, the letter warm against his chest. He knew now that Henry had left him more than memory. He had left him a mission, and Daniel would see it through. 3 days after discovering Henry's letter, the uneasy peace of Brindleford shattered. Word had spread faster than Daniel expected, whispers through the town square, murmurs at the bakery, sly remarks outside the gas station. By the week's end, those whispers solidified into a knock on the door of Henry's house. Daniel answered to find 3 figures standing on the porch, each familiar by blood but distant in spirit. They were Henry's estranged relatives, people who had been absent at the funeral, but had not missed the scent of opportunity. At their head stood Leonard Mayfield, Henry's nephew by marriage. He was in his late 40s, stout but not strong, his belly pressing against the buttons of his gray wool coat. His face was broad, his nose slightly crooked from a bar fight in his youth, his lips pursed in a smirk that rarely reached his eyes. A man who had once tried and failed to run a furniture business, Leonard had become known for chasing quick money and blaming others for his failures. His thinning black hair was slicked back, and his eyes, small and calculating, darted around the porch as though tallying up the worth of every board. Beside him stood his sister, Marjorie Fenn. Tall and angular, her frame wrapped in an expensive, fur-lined coat that clashed against the modest house, she carried herself with an air of disdain. Her dyed auburn hair was styled into careful waves, but her pale skin was stretched too tight across sharp cheekbones, as if her hunger for wealth had stripped her softness away. Her mouth curved downward in a constant look of judgment. Marjorie was known for her sharp tongue at community meetings, always the first to complain about taxes and the last to lend a hand. The third figure hung slightly back, a young man named Calvin, Leonard's son, no more than 22. He was tall, with a wiry build, shaggy brown hair that fell across his forehead, and eyes that shifted uneasily from his father to the ground. His hands were jammed into the pockets of his frayed denim jacket, his posture slouched. Calvin had a reputation in town for drifting between jobs, his loyalty bent easily by whoever promised him the most comfort. Unlike his elders, however, his face betrayed uncertainty. Greed had not yet hardened into conviction. Leonard wasted no time. "We heard about the bell," he said, his voice carrying both false sympathy and greedy undertones. "It's sitting up there collecting dust. Henry's gone now, and truth be told, that thing could fetch a fortune from collectors or those tourist towns. People love a story, Daniel. You're sitting on gold." Daniel's jaw tightened. He stood square in the doorway, his shoulders filling the frame. His voice, low and steady, left no room for negotiation. "It's not for sale," Marjorie scoffed, stepping forward, her heels clicking against the porch. "Don't be ridiculous. It's a lump of metal. No one cares about it anymore except you. Imagine what it could bring if displayed in some heritage park. Money that could be put to better use than rusting in an attic." Before Daniel could reply, Rex appeared at his side. The German shepherd's fur bristled, his hackles raised, and a low growl rolled from his chest like distant thunder. His ears pinned forward, eyes locked on Leonard and Marjorie with sharp, unflinching focus. He stepped past Daniel, planting himself squarely between the intruders and the attic stairs, visible at the end of the hall. His body was rigid, tail low, ready to spring if needed. Calvin shifted back a step, his unease plain. "Dad, maybe we should—" he began, but Leonard cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Quiet. It's just a dog," he sneered, though his voice faltered slightly under the intensity of Rex's stare. Daniel's voice rose then, not in anger but in authority, the tone of a man who had buried silence and was done with compromise. "That bell is not yours. It was never yours. It is the memory of this town, the breath of its mornings, the warning of its storms. Whoever looks at it and sees only coins has already lost their heart." His words hung in the air, heavy as stone. Marjorie's lips tightened. "Fine words, Daniel, but words don't pay bills. You think you're some guardian of tradition? You're just a bitter man clinging to the past." Daniel stepped forward then, his presence filling the small space, his eyes hard as iron. "If you want to strip the soul out of this town, you'll have to step past me, and past him." He gestured toward Rex, who growled again. Louder this time, the sound vibrating through the wooden floor. For a moment, no one moved. The draft through the open doorway made the lamp flicker, casting sharp shadows across their faces. Calvin's gaze flicked once more to the dog, then to Daniel, and finally down to his shoes. He muttered, "Let's go," his voice low, but Leonard snapped, "Not yet." But Rex took one step forward, his growl turning into a short, sharp bark that cracked through the house like a warning shot. Leonard flinched, Marjorie gasped, and even Calvin stumbled back. The spell broke. Leonard's bravado faltered, his smirk twisting into irritation. "This isn't over," he spat, tugging his coat tighter as he turned toward the door. "We'll be back, and when we do, that bell won't be yours to keep." Daniel stood motionless as they retreated down the porch steps, their voices fading into the street. Only when they disappeared from sight did he turn to Rex, crouching to meet the dog's steady gaze. He rested a hand on Rex's back, feeling the strength in his companion's muscles, the calm steadiness in his eyes. "Good boy," he whispered, though his voice was thick with emotion. "We'll guard it together." The attic remained silent above them, but Daniel felt its weight more strongly than ever. The storm of greed had arrived, and it would not be the last. Time 0.5. The night after Leonard's threat, the air over Brindleford turned bitter cold. The square lay hushed beneath a waning moon, its cobblestones silvered with frost. Inside Henry's old house, Daniel Harper sat in the parlor with Rex at his feet, the German shepherd's ears flicking at every sound outside. Daniel had kept the attic locked, the iron key never leaving his pocket. Still, unease coiled in his chest. Henry's letter echoed in his mind. They will come for it. It was near midnight when the silence broke. A sharp creak at the back door, followed by the soft scrape of a boot. Rex's head shot up instantly, lips curling back from his teeth. Daniel rose, muscles tense, just as the door splintered inward. Leonard and Marjorie rushed in first, flashlights cutting through the gloom. Behind them came Calvin, his face pale in the beam, eyes wide with hesitation. Another man followed, Harlan Briggs, a hired brute known in town for his heavy fists and lack of conscience. Harlan was a mountain of a man, over 6 feet tall with a barrel chest, thick arms corded with muscle, a jaw covered in patchy stubble, and a scar across his forehead from a logging accident. His eyes were small and hard, his mouth set in a line that betrayed no second thoughts. Leonard barked, "The key, Daniel! Hand it over!" His voice cracked with both greed and fear. Before Daniel could reply, Rex lunged. The German shepherd moved like lightning, his deep bark splitting the night as he barreled into Harlan's chest. The brute stumbled backward, his flashlight crashing against the wall. Rex snarled, teeth bared, forcing Harlan to shield his face with thick forearms. Marjorie shrieked, stumbling against a chair, while Leonard cursed, fumbling to reach into Daniel's coat. Daniel swung first, his fist connecting with Leonard's jaw. Years of welding and labor had kept Daniel's arms strong, and Leonard staggered back with a howl. Calvin froze in the doorway, torn between his father's shouts and the sight of Rex holding his ground. "Do something!" Leonard screamed at him, but Calvin's hands stayed buried in his pockets, trembling. Harlan recovered quickly, shoving Rex hard to the floor. The dog rolled, growled low, and sprang again, his weight driving into the man's legs. Harlan stumbled, crashing into the table, sending the lamp tumbling. Shadows jumped violently across the walls. Daniel grappled with Leonard, the two men straining, boots sliding against the worn rug. Marjorie darted toward the hallway, shrieking, "The attic! The bell!" But Rex whipped around at Daniel's shout, planting himself between her and the stairs, his barks booming with fury. She stopped dead, her face blanching as the dog's eyes locked on hers. For a few breathless moments the room was chaos. The clash of fists, Rex's snarls, Marjorie's shrill protests. Then Daniel shoved Leonard hard against the wall, pinning him by the collar. His voice thundered steadier than Ipoka felt. "This ends now. You want to steal what belongs to this town? You'll answer for it." Rex growled deep in his chest, forcing Harlan and Marjorie to retreat a step. Calvin finally spoke, his voice cracking. "Dad. Aunt Marjorie, stop. We can't win this. It isn't right." His words hung trembling in the air, and for the first time, Leonard's fury faltered. The commotion drew neighbors. Marnie Booker, the baker, appeared at the window clutching a lantern, and young Tom Riley ran from the street with 2 others. They burst into the house, shouting. The intruders, seeing the tide turning, stumbled back. Leonard snarled, spitting blood, but Daniel's grip on his collar forced him to stillness. "Out," Daniel said, "but you'll answer for this in court." 2 weeks later, the courthouse in Brindleford was packed. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of townsfolk who had come to witness the trial. At the front sat Judge Walter Grayson, a man in his early 60s with a square jaw dusted in gray stubble, deep lines etched across his weathered face, and eyes that missed little. Grayson had lived in Brindleford his whole life, and was known for his stern fairness. He had once worked as a lawyer defending minors, which left him with both compassion for the working class and no patience for deceit. Daniel sat with his lawyer, Claire Hammond. Claire was in her mid-30s, tall and slender, with chestnut hair cut neatly at her shoulders and pale skin that glowed against her navy suit. Her green eyes carried the calm fire of someone used to being underestimated, and then winning. She was sharp in her words, strategic in her pauses, and her presence commanded the room. Rex lay at Daniel's feet, calm now but alert, his eyes never leaving the aisle where Leonard and Marjorie sat with their own legal counsel. Claire rose to present the case. She held Henry's notebooks aloft, her voice clear and resonant. "This bell is not an object of trade. It is a living history. Here are the records of its use, when it saved families from flood, when it warned of fire, when it guided searchers to a lost child. And here, Your Honor," she laid Henry's final letter on the stand, "are the words of the man who gave his life to guard it. He knew this day might come. He knew some would try to strip its soul for money. He trusted his son to defend it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Canfield, frail but resolute, stepped forward as a witness. Her voice trembled but carried weight. "That bell saved my grandson during the flood of '98. If it hadn't rung through the storm, he'd have drowned. To sell it would be to erase our lives." Tom Riley followed, speaking simply but firmly. "Henry taught me what duty means. That bell ain't metal. It's a promise." Leonard's lawyer muttered weak arguments about property rights and salvage value, but the judge's eyes narrowed. Grayson leaned forward, his voice steady as stone. "This court finds the bell to be a protected heritage of Brindleford. It shall remain as a community legacy. It is not to be sold, traded, or treated as private profit. It belongs to the town, and to the memory of Henry Mayfield, its keeper." A hush fell, then a swell of relief. Daniel exhaled, shoulders slumping for the first time in weeks. Rex rose at his side, tail wagging faintly, sensing victory. Leonard and Marjorie sat stiff, their faces pale with defeat. Calvin kept his eyes lowered, shame written across his features. When Daniel left the courthouse, the autumn sun broke through the clouds, casting light across the square. He rested a hand on Rex's neck, whispering, "We did it, boy. For Henry, for the town." Rex pressed close, ears relaxed now, gaze steady as if guarding a victory both legal and eternal. For the first time in years, Daniel felt not just the weight of duty, but the lift of hope. The bell was safe, not just through loyalty, but through law. The morning of the memorial dawned crisp and clear, the first true blue sky Brindleford had seen in weeks. The frost had retreated under a pale sun, and the square, silent for so long, filled with life. Shopkeepers closed their doors for the day, children clutched their parents' hands, and old men shuffled in slowly, their canes clicking against the stones. The air buzzed not with commerce or chatter, but with something heavier: expectation. At the center of the square, the old belfry had been repaired and cleaned. Its timbers, scrubbed free of rot, stood proud again, painted a deep oak brown. The rope, frayed and nearly useless weeks earlier, had been replaced with a strong new cord. And at its heart, gleaming despite the tarnish that years had left behind, hung the bronze bell. Daniel Harper stood beneath it, his tall, broad-shouldered frame silhouetted against the morning sun. His gray hair caught the light, his jaw tense, his eyes shadowed with both grief and resolve. He wore a simple black coat, sleeves rolled back just enough to reveal the thick muscles of his forearms, scarred from years of labor. His hand rested on Rex's head. Rex sat at his side, ears alert, chest proud. The German shepherd's sable coat shimmered under the morning light, his muzzle grayed with age but his bearing unshaken. He sat so still he seemed carved from stone, though his dark eyes followed every movement in the square, protective and patient. Children whispered when they saw him, "That's the dog who stopped them. That's the guardian of the bell." The crowd pressed closer. In the front row stood Father Alcott, his long frame wrapped in a clean cassock, his tired eyes reflecting the light of quiet pride. Beside him was Mrs. Canfield, bundled in her worn shawl, tears already welling in her paper-thin eyes. Young Tom Riley stood too, his grease-stained jacket traded for a pressed shirt, his jaw set, his expression filled with unspoken respect. Even Marnie Booker had stepped from her bakery, flour still dusting her sleeves, her lips trembling as she clutched a small bouquet of daisies. At the edge of the crowd, a few who had once doubted Henry lingered in uneasy silence, faces flushed with shame, hands twisting nervously. They had mocked the man in life, but now, confronted with the weight of his legacy, they could not find words. Claire Hammond, Daniel's lawyer, stood near the judge, tall and steady in her navy coat. She gave Daniel a single nod, her green eyes warm, as if to remind him that justice had already been won in law. Today was for something deeper. Daniel took a deep breath. His voice carried across the square, rough but steady. "We gather not just for a man, but for a promise. Henry Mayfield gave this town more than sound. He gave it vigilance, safety, and memory. He asked that this bell remain. Today, we keep his vow." He turned, gripping the rope. Rex shifted closer, his ears twitching as the rope drew taut. Daniel pulled with all, his strength. The first strike shook the square. The bell's voice rang out, deep and resonant, rolling over the rooftops, seeping into alleys, pressing against every door. It carried into kitchens and bedrooms, into barns and workshops, reaching ears that had not heard it in years. The sound was no longer just noise. It was the heartbeat of Brindleford returned. The second strike followed, fuller, brighter, and with it came tears. Mrs. Canfield wept openly, pressing her hands together in gratitude. Tom Riley's head dropped as he wiped his sleeve roughly across his eyes. Even Father Alcott's stern jaw softened, his lips moving in silent prayer. The third strike rang like a final seal, echoing into the hills beyond the town. Children clapped instinctively, their small palms smacking together until the entire crowd joined in, applause swelling, laughter and sobs rising together. People looked at one another, their faces shining, as if reminded of something they had forgotten. Unity. Daniel stepped back, letting the rope fall slack. His hand touched the cool bronze of the bell, steady against its massive curve. His voice dropped to a whisper, but those near him heard. "This sound will live, as long as I hold my promise." Rex rose, ears erect, his chest lifting as he gave a single sharp bark. The sound cracked through the air like lightning, echoing against the stone walls of the courthouse and the bakery, joining the last hum of the bell. The townsfolk gasped, then smiled, and some raised their hands high as if to salute. In that moment, dog and bell and man bound the square together with one vow. The sun rose higher, casting golden light across the town. For the first time in years, Brindleford's silence was broken not by traffic, not by alarms, but by the voice of its soul. When the bell of Brindleford rang once more, it was not only the voice of a town restored, it was a reminder that God often works through the simplest things. A bronze bell, worn by time, became more than metal. It became the vessel of memory, courage, and faith. Just as Henry's hands once struck it to save lives, the sound now strikes at our hearts to awaken something greater. The call to never forget, the call to love, and the call to stand for what is right. In our daily lives, we each have a bell to guard. Perhaps it is our family, our honesty, our faith, or the small acts of kindness we give freely. These are the things that, when protected, echo far beyond us. Miracles are not always fire from heaven. Sometimes they are the quiet persistence of a man and his loyal dog, refusing to let light be extinguished. May God bless every one of you watching, and may His grace keep your own bells ringing strong in the silence of this world. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others. Leave a comment with your thoughts or prayers, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another journey of love, faith, and courage. May the Lord watch over you and your loved ones tonight and always.